My guest at this time is Emilie Kao. She is director of the Devos Center for Religion and Civil Society at the Heritage Foundation here in Washington. She joins me now to discuss the content and status of the so-called Equality Act. The legislation, sponsored by Democrats, passed the House in recent weeks by a vote of 236 to 173. Supporters of the bill say it simply prevents discrimination for LGBT Americans in areas like housing and employment. But critics warn that the effects would actually reach much farther than that. And Emilie, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Well, supporters, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but supporters say they essentially want to extend anti-discrimination laws that already exist pertaining to race, ethnicity, religion, and sex to also include sexual orientation and gender identity. How does that match up with what's actually in the bill?
Well, we don't think anyone should be discriminated against simply because they're gay or transgender. Everyone should be treated with respect. But the problem with the Equality Act is that it doesn't treat everyone with respect. It basically codifies ideologies about sexual orientation and sex differences into civil rights law, and that will lead to the punishment of people who don't agree with those viewpoints, as we have seen with similar state laws.
And let's talk about that. We've seen allegations of discrimination abound really since the 2015 Obergefell decision legalizing same-sex marriage in the U.S. We've seen florists and bakers and photographers and others sued for refusing to be part of a ceremony that they say conflicts with their deeply personal religious beliefs. What recourse would those folks have if this legislation were enacted?
Well, I'm glad you pointed out those state laws and the lawsuits against wedding vendors. I mean, that's exactly the problem that would be exacerbated if this became federal law. You'd see multiplication of those types of lawsuits around the country. And there would be no recourse for people who have religious objections because the Equality Act explicitly says that the Religious Freedom Restoration Act is not available as a defense to any claim brought under the Equality Act. So those situations would be amplified. And it wouldn't simply be disagreement on marriage that's punished. It would also be disagreement on the fact that there are only two sexes. That would also be punished.
Dig into that a little bit more, because obviously with the folks we talked about with the wedding vendors, that's their business and there could potentially be an actual contract involved here. But you're saying if you just publicly express an opinion that's against sexual orientation or gender identity and those sorts of issues, there can be legal consequences for you?
Well, we've already seen that in states that have passed similar laws that teachers have been fired for simply using the biologically correct pronouns for students, that when the schools adopt those policies, it ends up punishing people when they don't use a pronoun or a name that a transgender identifying person likes them to use. And so there are real consequences to disagreement on gender identity under these laws. Similarly, we've also seen Catholic hospitals sued under state laws like the Equality Act when they declined to perform sex reassignment procedures, including a 16-year-old girl who wanted a double mastectomy. So unfortunately, we would see litigation just proliferate around the country if these ideologies were codified into civil rights law.
And talk about how this affects parental rights a little bit more. There's the issue that you just referenced there about parents not having necessarily much of a say over what their minor children claim they identify as. What about that? And what about parents simply raising concerns about what their kids are being taught in the public schools?
So the politicization of medicine, according to transgender theory, would make it very difficult for parents to find any sort of treatment, whether it's talk therapy or any kind of counseling that would be helping their children who have gender dysphoria or helping their child who has same-sex attraction. Those talk therapy, counseling type of services would be banned under the Equality Act. So the only recourse that the parents would have would be to go to the types of gender clinics that are proliferating around the country, which perform sex reassignment surgeries and also provide hormones to children. And we've seen in Ohio a Catholic family lost custody of their daughter when the Cincinnati Children's Hospital said that she should be taking testosterone for gender dysphoria. When the parents disagreed, the state charged her charged the parents with child abuse, and a judge terminated their custody.
We're talking with Emilie Kao. She's director of the Devos Center for Religion and Civil Society at the Heritage Foundation. And I know another issue that's been in the news a lot lately, Emilie, is athletic competition. A lot of folks from grade school to high school, and now even, I believe, at the Olympic level, are essentially allowing biological males to compete against girls or women based on the identity that they profess. And so what is the impact of that on girls?
It would be the end of girls-only and women-only sports. It would lead to the defeat of women and girls, in many sports at all levels. We already saw just recently the NCAA championships in the 400-meter hurdles were won by a biological boy competing in the women's division. So we have already seen world records smashed by biological men who identify as women, and we would see women basically becoming bystanders in their own sports.
What happens next? Obviously, it's passed the House by a fairly comfortable margin. Republicans, as most folks know, run the Senate. So is it pretty much dead on arrival there? Will it be entertained in any form or fashion? What's your understanding there?
Well, the Senate definitely should not take up a terrible bill like this. But I expect that we will see an continued intense fighting at the state level, particularly on the issue you raised earlier on LGBT curriculum. We're seeing parents across the country who are simply saying it's my right to teach my own child about sexual issues, whether it's sexual orientation or transgender theory. It's my right to teach them in my own way and my own time, and it's not the right of the school or the teachers to impose this upon my child, especially when, in many cases, the parents are not even informed that, children as young as kindergarten are being read stories in which they're told something that is a fallacy, which is that a person can transition from one sex to the other sex.
Emilie, you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation that you believe all Americans ought to be treated with respect and ought to be treated equally, but you clearly feel that the Equality Act goes too far and does not treat everyone equally. Do you believe that existing law is essentially sufficient, or do there need to be some additional protections, but not legislation that goes as far as the bill we've been talking about?
Well, I think that a lot of the statements from the supporters of the Equality Act, they don't really add up. There are no documented cases of the kind of discrimination that they're claiming, that a person is going into a hospital and they're denied, treatment like for a broken ankle simply because they're gay or transgender. What you are seeing, again, is disagreement over sexual orientation or gender identity being punished. So you are seeing these lawsuits against hospitals that won't perform sex reassignment because they think it's actually harmful to the patients. And so I think the way that the state laws, like the Equality Act, are being abused to punish disagreement are a good indicator of the problems with laws like the Equality Act. And so I think what really people should be aware of is the endangerment of religious freedom that's already happening at the state level, the endangerment of parental rights, and the endangerment of women and girls' safety and privacy, not to mention fairness in sports.
Why is there such a push to punish disagreement on this issue, do you think?
Well, I think you started off with mentioning the Obergefell versus Hodges decision in 2017, where the Supreme Court redefined marriage. And shortly after that, we just saw an intensifying number of attacks on people who believe that marriage is between a man and a woman, despite the fact that the Supreme Court said in the Obergefell decision that these are decent and honorable views, that they are, held by people who are very sincere in their beliefs. We see an increasing assault from the left on people who hold the belief that marriage is between a man and a woman, and now people who simply believe that, there are men and there are women, and there are not 50-plus gender identities. Unfortunately, it has become very polarized, despite the fact that, gay people or people who identify as transgender are able to live as they want. I mean, this month is Gay Pride Month, and we'll see corporate America celebrating, LGBT culture, I think that's an indication of how much acceptance there already is in our society.
And the President of the United States even issuing a statement in support of the observance this month, which leads into my last topic here. Emilie, what's your sense of how big of an issue this is, particularly on the right? Most Republicans in the House voted against this. 8 supported it. But there seems to be far more energy on the right in opposing things like the Green New Deal, and a lot of folks flocking to cameras and microphones and want to talk about that issue as opposed to this debate, which seemed to be a lot more quiet. Where do you think the Republican Party is on these issues now that the public isn't so lopsided in their favor like they were a decade or more ago?
Well, I actually think there's bipartisan opposition to the Equality Act, because you'll see that when you look at what's happening to women and girls, it's feminists and lesbians who are, supporting the same positions that the Heritage Foundation holds. And that's why we've been able to work with groups on the left in opposing the Equality Act, because they see the danger to women and to girls. We see in England, where they've passed gender identity policies, that convicted sexual offenders, men, have been allowed into women's prisons where they've, again, committed sexual assault. And that's why you see around the world women, feminists, lesbians are opposed to gender identity policies. So I hope that the Republicans will take a closer look at the real victims of these types of laws, and that they will do what is right, which is to oppose the imposition of this ideology.
Emilie, we'll see what happens in the Senate. Based on your prediction, it sounds like not much, but obviously the debate goes on, as you said, at the state and other levels, and I'm sure it'll be a campaign issue as well. Thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Emilie Kao is director of the Devos Center for Religion and Civil Society at the Heritage Foundation in Washington. I'm Greg Corombos reporting for Radio America.